There's a specific look some people get right after they've clearly done something wrong. And it isn't guilt, and it isn't shame either. It's something closer to confusion, as if the accusation itself is the strange part, not the thing they actually did. I noticed it first in someone I knew well. A raised eyebrow, a slightly tilted head, and once I saw it, I couldn't stop noticing it everywhere else. A voice that goes soft and wounded at exactly the moment it should go quiet and accountable. It made me wonder what actually happens inside a person the instant they choose innocence over honesty. He does this more often than you'd expect, and almost never on purpose in the way we usually imagine lying to be purposeful. He isn't rehearsing a performance backstage before stepping into a difficult conversation. Something faster is happening, something that feels to him like self-protection rather than deliberate deception. I started paying closer attention to the moments right before the innocent face appears, and what I found wasn't calculation at all. It was fear, moving so quickly through him that it looked, from the outside, like composure. Think about the last time someone was caught in something small, a broken plan, a forgotten promise, a comment they clearly made in front of witnesses. The easiest response would be a simple acknowledgement, a short apology, nothing more complicated than that. Instead, many people reach for surprise first, a kind of wide-eyed confusion that quietly buys them a few extra seconds. Those seconds matter more than they seem to in the moment. In that brief window, the brain is scrambling to decide whether the truth is survivable, and often it quietly decides the truth is not. What surprised me most was realizing this pattern rarely starts in adulthood at all. It usually starts early, in a household where mistakes were treated as character flaws instead of ordinary events. A child who spills something and gets scolded as though he ruined the entire evening learns a lesson that has nothing to do with the spill. He learns, without anyone explaining it directly, that being wrong and being bad are somehow the same thing. From that point forward, admitting a mistake doesn't feel like simple honesty. It feels like confessing to something much larger than the moment ever actually was. You may recognize this if you think back carefully to your own childhood dinner table. Maybe a parent's disappointment felt heavier than the actual offense deserved. Maybe silence followed a mistake far longer than it should have, long enough to feel like punishment in itself. Children absorb these patterns without ever naming them, without ever questioning whether the lesson made sense. They simply learn, quietly and permanently, that innocence is safer territory than truth, even when the truth is obvious to everyone else in the room. That isn't the interesting part yet, though, and it took me a while to notice what actually was. The interesting part is what happens when this childhood strategy follows someone into adult relationships where the stakes are supposedly much lower, but somehow feel just as dangerous. He forgets an anniversary, and instead of simply apologizing, he explains why it really wasn't his fault at all.
He's late again, and instead of owning it plainly, he mentions traffic, a phone call, a series of small obstacles that conveniently erase his responsibility. None of this feels like lying to him in the moment, because it genuinely feels like survival instead. I began noticing this most clearly in marriages that had lasted decades, the kind where two people know each other's patterns better than anyone else ever will. A wife will describe almost affectionately how her husband has never once admitted to being wrong about anything in 40 years of marriage. She says it like a joke, the way people do to soften something painful. But there's something underneath that joke, a quiet exhaustion that comes from carrying every mistake alone in a partnership meant to be shared equally by two people. And that's where everything starts changing. Because the innocent face isn't really about the specific mistake at all. It's about what admitting the mistake would mean for how he sees himself afterward. Somewhere along the way, being wrong became tangled up with being unworthy, unlovable, fundamentally flawed in a way that couldn't be repaired later. Protecting his innocence isn't really about protecting a lie, even though it looks that way from the outside. It's about protecting a fragile idea of who he believes he's allowed to be. At first, this seems harmless enough, a small defense mechanism that quietly keeps the peace at home, until you notice how much distance it slowly creates over years without anyone fully realizing it. Every time someone deflects instead of admitting fault, the person across from them absorbs a small, specific message without either of them saying it aloud. Your feelings about this moment matter less than my comfort with myself right now. Over years, that message accumulates quietly, turning ordinary partnerships into something lonelier than either person ever expected when they first started. I kept wondering why this pattern shows up so strongly in men specifically, and the answer wasn't as simple as I first assumed it would be. Boys are often taught, without anyone saying it directly out loud, that competence is identity itself. Being capable, being right, being firmly in control, these become the currency of worth long before adulthood even arrives. A boy who cries after making a mistake is often told to toughen up quickly. A boy who defends himself confidently instead is quietly praised for showing strength. The lesson lands early in life, and it stays late. He carries that lesson into every single room he enters as an adult. A workplace mistake becomes something to explain away rather than admit honestly, because admitting it feels like conceding weakness in an environment that already feels precarious. A friendship disagreement becomes an argument to win instead of a misunderstanding to gently repair, because losing that argument feels dangerously close to losing status entirely. None of this is really about the argument itself. It's about an old fear that never got properly resolved. I saw this play out once at a small-town hardware store of all places between a longtime employee and his manager. The manager pointed out a mistake in the inventory count, quietly, without any real accusation in his tone at all. The employee's face shifted instantly, not into apology, but into a kind of wounded bewilderment, as though the manager had insulted something far bigger than a spreadsheet. He explained at length why the numbers weren't really his responsibility that week. Watching it happen in real time, stripped of any family history or old resentment, made the pattern easier to see clearly for what it actually was. Little by little, this becomes a way of moving through the entire world, not just certain relationships within it.
Church communities notice the same man who apologizes beautifully in public and never once does the same in private. Neighborhood friendships notice the same man who admits fault easily over small things, but becomes rigid the moment something touches closer to his character. Military veterans I've spoken with describe this pattern intensely, a lifetime of training built around never showing a crack, even decades after the uniform came off for good. You might be picturing someone specific right now, someone in your family who almost never admits he was wrong. When he comes close, he quickly adds a reason why it wasn't really his fault. Maybe it's a father, or maybe it's a brother instead. Maybe, if you're being fully honest with yourself, it's someone looking back at you in the mirror this very morning. This pattern doesn't require malice in order to exist and repeat itself. It only requires an old wound that was never given permission to properly heal. What makes this even more complicated is how convincing the innocent face actually becomes over time. He isn't always aware that he's performing it, even when it looks obvious to everyone watching. Years of repetition turn the response into something automatic, almost indistinguishable from genuine belief in the moment. He may truly feel innocent, not because the facts support it, but because some part of him has quietly rewritten the story just enough to survive it. This isn't the same as being a skilled, calculated liar. It's closer to being a frightened child still wearing an adult's face. I remember watching this unfold during a family dinner, the kind with adult children and their own families gathered around a familiar table. Someone brought up an old hurt, gently, almost carefully, the way people do when they're testing whether the moment is finally safe enough. The response wasn't anger at all, which surprised most of the room. It was surprise, genuine-looking surprise, as if the memory belonged to someone else entirely. The adult child looked stunned, not because the story was false, but because no one had ever said it out loud before that night. That's when I started understanding the deeper pattern underneath all of this behavior. Every deflection, every wide-eyed denial, every calm explanation for something clearly and obviously wrong, all of it traces back to one core fear underneath everything else. If I admit this, some part of him believes, I will stop being someone worth loving. That fear doesn't announce itself directly to anyone, including himself. It hides behind traffic excuses and forgotten promises and long, reasonable-sounding explanations for behavior that needed none of that at all. Once you see that fear clearly, so much of the behavior stops feeling frustrating and starts feeling almost tragic instead. He isn't protecting a lie because he enjoys deception for its own sake. He's protecting a version of himself that feels far too fragile to survive honest examination. Somewhere along the way, he quietly decided that mistakes were unforgivable. Every defensive reaction since then has simply been an attempt to avoid discovering whether that early decision was ever actually true. Retirement seems to intensify this pattern rather than soften it, which genuinely surprised me when I first noticed it happening. Men who spent decades building an identity around competence at work suddenly lose that structure entirely overnight. The fear of being seen as flawed doesn't disappear along with the job, and if anything, it grows louder in the quiet that follows retirement. Health appointments become uncomfortable in a similar way, moments where vulnerability is medically necessary but emotionally unbearable for someone who has spent an entire lifetime carefully avoiding it. Phone conversations reveal this too, in smaller, quieter ways than you might expect. A son calls his father to gently ask about a decision from years earlier, something that clearly caused pain within the family. The father changes the subject smoothly, almost gracefully, redirecting the conversation toward weather or work instead. It isn't rudeness, and it rarely feels that way to either person involved.
It's avoidance so practiced over decades that it no longer even feels like avoidance to the person doing it. Weekend gatherings often expose the pattern most visibly of all, especially when alcohol loosens inhibition just enough for old resentments to finally surface. Someone finally says the thing that's been unsaid for years, sometimes decades, and the response is almost always the same predictable shape. Confusion first, then a calm explanation, then a subtle redirection of blame towards circumstances or other people entirely. The room grows quiet afterward, not from anger exactly, but from recognizing a pattern too familiar to challenge directly in that moment. I started realizing that every one of these moments, the dinner table, the phone call, the retirement silence, the weekend confession, belonged to the exact same psychological structure underneath. None of them were separate problems that happened to resemble each other by coincidence. They were different rooms in the same house, a house built early in childhood and reinforced every single time honesty felt too dangerous to attempt safely. The behavior itself never really changed at all, and only the setting around it ever did. There's a particular kind of grief that belongs only to the people standing across from this pattern, waiting for an honesty that never quite arrives. It isn't the dramatic grief of loss, but something quieter, closer to slowly lowering your expectations of what closeness with this person can actually look like. You stop asking for the apology you deserve, not because you've forgiven the pattern, but because you've quietly learned something instead. Some doors simply don't open, no matter how gently you knock on them. Maybe you've been quietly gathering evidence about someone like this for years without fully realizing what you were actually looking at. Maybe you've excused it as personality, as simple stubbornness, as just how he is and always has been since childhood. But personality alone doesn't usually explain why the pattern appears so consistently across decades and across entirely different relationships. Fear does explain it, though. A very old and very specific fear that was never given the chance to be proven wrong even once. And here's the part that quietly changes everything once you finally understand it clearly. The innocent face was never really about the mistake sitting right in front of him. It was about every mistake that came before it, stretching all the way back to a child who learned that being wrong meant being unlovable somehow. Every deflection since then has simply been an attempt to protect that same child from a lesson he was never actually taught correctly in the very first place. Maybe you've watched someone like him for years, quietly frustrated and quietly hurt inside. You never understood why the pattern refused to change, no matter how clearly you explained yourself to him. Maybe you've become him without ever realizing it, defending your own mistakes instinctively before you've even had time to consider whether defense was truly necessary. Maybe you've misunderstood someone in your life for far longer than you'd like to admit right now, mistaking fear for arrogance and mistaking self-protection for simple indifference toward you. None of this excuses the distance these patterns quietly create, the years of unspoken resentment, the loneliness that grows slowly inside relationships that never got the honesty they truly deserved. But understanding where it comes from changes how it feels to witness it happening. It stops looking like plain cruelty and starts looking like an old, unfinished conversation. It's a conversation a person has been having with himself since childhood, one he's never known how to properly end. If today's conversation explained why people protect their innocence even when the truth is obvious to everyone around them, something else naturally follows. The next conversation leads somewhere different entirely from here. What happens to the people standing across from him, the ones who quietly absorb these unspoken accusations for years without ever being given the honesty they were rightfully owed? That question deserves its own space to unfold slowly, and I think it might explain even more than today's conversation did. Thank you sincerely for spending this time thinking alongside me today. If this helped you understand someone in your life a little more clearly, or maybe helped you understand yourself a little better, consider letting the video know with a like. I'd genuinely love to know in the comments below whether you recognized someone specific while watching this and whether that recognition changed how you feel about them now. If conversations like this mean something to you personally, consider subscribing since there's so much more of this thinking left to continue together.